first of all, it very much depends. This comes back to your point about preparing, because I gave the example of when you don't prepare, but most of the time, obviously, you do prepare. And this links very closely with the kind of questions you ask. It will depend, first of all, on what is the outcome you want from the interview. What kind of interview are you doing? So some interviews are very straight. They are information gathering interviews, essentially. You may be interviewing someone who is far more of an expert than you are. So, you know, interviewing that I would be doing through COVID, there's no point me trying to read every single thing I can about the mutations of COVID-19. I will never understand it better than the person I'm interviewing. So with interviews like that, you think, I don't need to be the expert here. I'm not trying to show off. I'm not trying to prove what I know. My job is to ask really simple questions, to almost be the vessel for the audience, for the viewer, for the listener, and not try and be overly complicated or clever. So ask very open-ended, simple questions, which aren't definitely not compound questions, the kind of, you know, well, do we need to do this, or should we be thinking about this? And also, should we, you know, the person's like, well, that was 3 questions in one. So simplicity when you're doing those kind of information gathering interviews, I think is key. And not trying to showboat, not thinking I need to show what I know in this question. You hear it a lot, I think, on Radio 4. I have to say, I'm a great listener to the Today programme, but there's one journalist who used to be on that, whose questions were so long because they were part statement and part question. So they were sort of, well, given the complexity of the situation in Syria and the recent resignation of such and such and the change in policy of this, and you know, you'd be like, what's the question? We don't need to know that you know everything about Syria. We want to hear from the other person. So that's worth knowing. I think there are different kinds of questions needed if you're holding someone to account, if it's a slightly more challenging interview. So your questions may be more closed questions, which is definitely a no-no in coaching, but in some forms of journalism is needed, particularly with politicians who try and slither off the hook. They do sometimes need to be asked, is it this or is it that? You know, yes or no? Well, you know, what word are we going to use? Because the word is very specific. And are we saying this happened or didn't happen? So that then is quite forensic. And again, your preparation might need to have almost, I never worked on Newsnight, but my husband did. And he said that they would actually almost, what's the word, sort of plot interviews. And I'm not suggesting you generally wouldn't have to do this, but thinking if you're trying to get through a complex interview, you think, okay, I'm going to ask this question of this politician. They're likely to duck the question. So if they go down this route, we'll then ask that. If they go to, and you almost strategize the interview. So that can be quite interesting. You might need that forensic level, probably not in normal scenarios. And I think preparing and asking questions in most interviews is actually simply about curiosity, because most people we interview, and the bread and butter of a lot of journalists, particularly in local news, where I kind of cut my teeth, is interviewing real people. And they don't need fancy questions. They need you just to bring your human side and let them tell their story. So the questions should encourage them to tell their story. So lovely open questions. And yet if they're nervous, the preparation may have been around really reading up on their story and their experience. So you can prompt them a little bit, because sometimes people lose their train of thought and you know they've got some beautiful analogy to make or some brilliant particular part of the story that you don't want them to miss. And you can nudge them and help them, but not because you're badgering them, but because you want to showcase them and let them tell their story in a way that the listeners will really enjoy. So those kind of questions where you're just saying, you know, how did that feel? You know, tell us more about your daughter, or, you know, some really difficult interviews you have to do as a journalist, but that just letting something breathe a little bit.